In this video, we're going to over 3 stories involving deep ocean diving, with each one progressively more horrifying than the last. I have to warn you, the final story is particularly gruesome, even if it is true to the events as they occurred. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In April of 2003, somewhere in the Yellow Sea between North Korea and the Shandong province of China, a Chinese fishing boat noticed something odd sticking up out of the water. Initially, it looked almost like an antenna sticking out of the water, but as they got closer, they realized it was attached to a massive metal object. Eventually, they got close enough to realize that it was actually the periscope of a submarine, except it wasn't really doing anything. The entire time they watched it, it just kind of floated aimlessly. The fishing boat then contacted the Navy, who sent 2 boats to come to investigate the situation. Upon arriving, the 2 Navy vessels worried that it might be a submarine from one of the neighboring countries. This would have been a very serious intrusion in the controlled waters, but when they got closer to take a look, they were able to identify it as a Chinese submarine. In other words, it was one of their own ship. Then they tried to radio the ship or establish some communication with it, but all they got back was radio silence. The following day, the sub was finally boarded to figure out what was going on, and what they discovered was as terrifying as it was confusing. Upon opening the hatch, they immediately noticed how dark it was inside the sub. There was clearly no power, so no lights were on anywhere inside. Then they started walking through the sub, and they began to find the bodies of crew all over the place. And the weirdest part was that all of the crew were still at their stations and looked as though they were working and then just suddenly died, like they didn't even know they were in any danger. In total, 71 bodies were discovered on the ship with no survivors. Too high or the sub submerges, there's a valve that closes the snorkel to prevent water from getting in. At the same time, the diesel engine shuts off and the power is diverted to the batteries. Sometime before the discovery of the sub by the fishing vessel, the submarine either surfaced and the valve didn't open, or it was already surfaced and water was detected and the valve was closed. In either case, what should have happened was that the engine should not have been running. For some reason, it was running, and with no ventilation, it completely consumed all of the air inside of the sub in just 2 minutes. 1 minute after the air was sucked out of the sub, the men inside would have started to get lightheaded. 2 minutes after the air was sucked out, all of them would have been unconscious, and then by 3 minutes they would have all died due to asphyxia. This also would have created a suction inside of the sub that would have made it difficult to open any of the hatches, but it's likely this all happened so quickly anyway that no one even realized it. That's why all of the crew members were found at their stations seemingly unaware of any danger. Another possibility is that without ventilation, the diesel engine vented all of the exhaust into the sub, which would have been equally fatal. In any case, the sub was on some sort of drill to maintain stealth and therefore maintain radio silence. It's for this reason that it wasn't noticed by anyone in command. It's also for this reason that it was trying to ventilate partially submerged instead of fully on the surface. Ultimately, it was a combination of crew error and technical malfunction that led to the deaths of everyone on board. In September of 1975, 2 divers were working in the North Sea doing a special type of diving known as saturation diving. Their job was to make a relatively short dive to 390 feet or 120 meters and untangle rope that had gotten wrapped around the guidepost of a piece of machinery called a blowout preventer. This is a specialized piece of equipment used in oil and gas drilling that's crucial to keeping the pipeline operational. Now, in case you missed the last video, when commercial divers need to spend long periods of time underwater or do exceptionally deep dives, it's impractical to just scuba dive down regularly. Even for dives that are only moderately deep, the decompression time makes it entirely impractical. Instead, divers will descend in these metal chambers known as dive bells. They'll actually live in these chambers and then exit either through a hatch or drop down out through the bottom when they need to work. These bells are equipped with beds, food, washrooms, and all the equipment they need to live for, sometimes up to a month at a time. Then, once the job is done, they only need to do one long decompression when the dive bell is brought up instead of one after every dive. This work to decompression ratio is just way more practical. After the 2 men were finished their job for the day, they were hoisted back up to about 310 feet or 94 meters of depth, where they would then enter a small underwater complex. This was their living quarters for the job, which offered them just a little bit more space than a traditional bell. This complex was actually composed of 3 separate chambers. First was the bell, then on the other end was their living space, and then in the middle of those 2 chambers was a small chamber just used to transfer between the bell and the living space. At about 9:50 p.m., the bell made contact with the transfer chamber, which the divers then sealed together. These two metal rings look almost like the openings of a front-facing washing machine connected together. Once these two rings were connected, an attempt was made to pressurize the chamber to equalize it with the transfer chamber, but as gas started getting pumped in, a small leak was detected somewhere along the rings. The divers then disconnected the two chambers, cleaned the surfaces of rings, and then reconnected them. This isn't uncommon. Any dust or debris that gets in between can create an imperfect seal, which can then cause a leak. After the two chambers were reconnected, they tried to equalize the pressure once again, which seemed to work at first, so they started moving into the transfer chamber. As the two divers moved inside the transfer chamber actually started to leak once again. But rather than go through the whole process of disconnecting and cleaning the rings again, the supervisor told the men to just go into their living space. This would protect them from further pressure loss, and because the transfer chamber and living space were dry, there generally weren't any issues sealing that set of hatches. This is also all monitored by a supervisor who's above surface, either on a boat or the rig itself. Once they were inside, he had them lean on the door and then he pumped in a little bit of helium gas to seal the door. On the surface, the supervisor has an array of gauges and valves to adjust and monitor their conditions inside the chamber. The way these are set up is that each chamber has its own separate gauge, but they can also be reconfigured to monitor the other chambers as well. This gives them a series of backups in case of some malfunction with any single gauge. But more often than not, just a single gauge was used out of convenience, so as the men move through the chambers, the supervisor will just switch the gauge to the section they're in at the time to monitor the pressure. After he injected the helium into the room, the door was sealed correctly, but he hadn't changed the gauge from the middle chamber to the living space. This meant that to him, it seemed as though the chamber was still losing pressure, and thinking that it was still losing pressure, he started pumping tons of pure helium into the space. But instead of sealing the door, the room was now being pressurized like crazy. This went on for several minutes before he finally realized the mistake he had made. And when he finally realized the living space had been pressurized to almost double what it was supposed to be, this rapid compression combined with the high thermal transfer of helium gas and the high humidity in the chamber caused the temperature inside to go from 32 Celsius to 49 Celsius or 90 Fahrenheit to 120 Fahrenheit with almost 100% humidity. This would have been like being inside an oven, and because the humidity was so high, the men's ability to sweat to cool themselves off was severely reduced. They frantically tried to open the hatch door, but because of how pressurized the chamber was, it was impossible. And for some other unknown reason, the supervisor couldn't relieve the pressure inside the room either, once he realized his mistake. In an attempt to find some relief from the heat, the divers pulled their mattresses from their beds and laid down against the cool aluminum. Finally, another diver was sent down to manually relieve the pressure and open the chamber, but by the time he got inside the transfer chamber and looked through the porthole, the men were unresponsive. In the few hours it took to reach them, tragically, the men had died of hypothermia or heat stroke. This was the first recorded case of saturation diving death due to overheating. Typically, sat divers deal with extreme cold at the ocean floor and are often at risk of becoming hypothermic. It's for this reason that chambers are kept as warm as they are in the first place. So between the already warm chamber and the series of mistakes, the men were cooked alive inside their living quarters. St. Croix is a small island that is part of the US Virgin Islands and is just east of Puerto Rico. As with most tropical islands, the water is perfect for supporting all sorts of sea life and rich coral reefs, making it ideal for diving. And although the entire island is surrounded by rich diving spots, there is one spot in particular that is famous because of a unique feature. This is a spot known as the Cane Bay Wall. What makes the spot unique is that just a couple of 100 feet from the shore, the water goes from 40 feet deep to 13,000 feet deep in a single almost vertical drop. This means that you can stand on the edge of this wall and look out into a bottomless abyss that would swallow up most of all but the tallest mountains in the continental United States. This is one of the largest vertical drop-offs anywhere in the ocean. In November of 1996, 3 commercial divers were diving that area of St. Croix, conducting research on the sea life of the Cane Bay Wall. They had set up some traps a week earlier, and now they were going to collect the samples as well as take some other measurements. All 3 of these individuals were highly experienced divers, each having hundreds of dives under their belt. So between the 3 of them, they had over 1,000 dives worth of experience. Once they were at the depth of the traps, which is around 220 feet or 67 meters, 2 of the men, Brett and Robbie, got to work taking samples. The 3rd man, Rod, was keeping track of their depth and timing and noticed 2 oceanic white-tip sharks swimming along the wall in the distance. As experienced divers, the men were entirely unfazed by this. Shark sightings are just a normal part of diving in the ocean. It was a bit rare to see these open water species so close to land, and they were also unusually large at around 14 feet long, so the three men stopped briefly to take some pictures before continuing on with their work. After spending their planned 15 minutes or so working at depth, they reached about the halfway point in their dive. This meant that it was now time to head back up to the surface. Their planned ascent would have Robbie go first, then Brett, then Rod would come up last. When they started to ascend, Robbie's air reading was a bit lower than expected because he had just been breathing a little bit heavier throughout the dive, so Brett told him to head on up to a shallower depth. Then Brett started to swim as well and noticed that Robbie was pointing back down to where Rod was, who was still down on the wall. Brett looked down and saw that Rod was covered in silt, like a dust cloud, covering him completely. To Brett, it looked like Rod might have had a hose failure, causing air to spray around and kick up the silt on the wall. This also meant that he might be leaking air and might need some extra air, so Brett swam back down to see if he needed any help. It was only once he got into the cloud of silt and got a better look that he could see that it wasn't a hose at all. Brett grabbed him and started pulling him and realized that Rod had a huge bite mark on his thigh. And as he was processing what he was seeing, the shark came in for another attack. The two of them tried desperately to hit its gills and keep it away, and as they were fighting it off, a second one swam in and grabbed a hold of his calf, causing the silt to become blood red. Then the first one came back and grabbed his thigh again and started pulling him violently. Even though Brett was pulling hard in the opposite direction, the shark was too strong and pulled the two of them right over the edge of the drop-off. Now, in essentially a free fall down the wall, the two of them tried desperately to fight off the sharks, while also rapidly consuming the air they had left. At one point, Brett checked his depth gauge and saw that it was maxed out at 325 feet, meaning they were some number of feet beyond what his depth gauge could even read and still descending. Finally, there was a brief break in the attack and Brett pulled the two of them into a small sandy cove in the wall. It was there that he finally had a chance to get a better look at Rod's condition, and he was horrified to see that Rod's left leg was almost completely torn off. Most of the tissue was gone, and he also had serious bites to his stomach and chest. Upon seeing this, Brett basically went into full panic mode and grabbed Rod and started swimming up as hard as he could, but within just a few seconds, the sharks came back and grabbed Rod again, pulling the both back down the wall, and as if things couldn't get any worse, Brett went to take a breath and it felt like he was pulling the air through a straw. This meant that he had just a few breaths left before he was completely out of air. Then another second later, the sharks ripped Rod right out of his hands and Brett watched helplessly as they pulled him deeper into the water. Almost out of air now himself, there was just nothing he could do to help Rod anymore, so he had to refocus on saving himself. Unfortunately, he was still at close to 400 feet of depth with almost no air. He started frantically swimming up towards the surface, and at one point he checked his depth gauge and saw that it was still redlined at 325 feet. Between the depth, the panic, and nitrogen narcosis, he just focused intensely on making strong, rhythmic kicks towards the light up above. He swam, and slowly his vision started to close up on him like a tunnel. As he swam, this tunnel got smaller and smaller until he had one final thought, which was that he was so close and that he passed out about 30 feet from the surface. Miraculously, his buoyancy device had just enough air in it to float him up to the surface and bring his head out of the water. Then, the pressure difference forced him to exhale and kick-started his breathing, and he woke up gasping for air. He took a few moments to look around and get his bearings and take in everything that had happened. Unfortunately, the third member of their team, Robbie, had already left to get help. The last thing he saw was the two of them go over the wall covered in blood, so the reasonable thing to do was assume they were dead and go get help. Now, because of how deep Brett had been and how quickly he resurfaced, he was already starting to suffer from decompression sickness. He had to get to shore quickly, or he risked passing out or becoming paralyzed. He got into shallow water, ripped off his scuba gear, and then ran to the nearest couple on the beach. He quickly told them who he was and that he had decompression sickness. Then, he told them which truck was his, where his keys were, and that there was a clipboard on the dashboard with emergency instructions. And just as he finished giving them those instructions, he passed out again. And although this was obviously a terrible situation, Brett was also incredibly lucky because the couple he had run into was a doctor and a nurse who were also familiar with decompression sickness. They quickly ran to his truck, grabbed the instructions, and then ran over to the phone at a nearby hotel. They called the marine lab he was employed by, who quickly called a medevac plane to come get him, and then from there, he was airlifted from St. Croix and flown to Puerto Rico because there weren't any decompression chambers on the island. Then, almost like something out of a movie, they ran out of oxygen on the plane he was in and had to land it on a highway, which was also coordinated with a helicopter landing to take him the remaining distance to the hospital. Finally, he got into a hospital and made an almost full recovery with some lasting effects from the decompression sickness. Unfortunately, Rod's body has never been found. Brett would later learn that there was a ship in the area emitting a low-frequency vibration that had attracted the sharks in the first place. It just wasn't known at the time that this could occur, ultimately resulting in the brutal attack. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate if you gave it a like. That helps out with the YouTube algorithm. Thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.